NUS Pro-Chancellor Mr. Poat-Mata, NUS President Professor Tan Eng Chai, members of the NUS Alumni Advisory Board, NUS alumni, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and a warm welcome to NUS120 Homecoming at Bukit Timah campus. I am Trisha, a Year 4 student from the Faculty of Law.
And I am Hanafi, a Year 3 student in the College of Design and Engineering. Thank you for joining us on a Saturday morning, and we're excited to have you with us today as we welcome alumni back to the Bukit Timah campus to reconnect with peers and make new friends within the NUS community. We are deeply honored to have with us some distinguished guests today. To officially begin the program, it is my pleasure to invite NUS Alumni Relation Deputy Director Ms. Brenda Tan to say a few words. Ms. Tan, please.
Good morning, everyone. Pro-Chancellor Mr. Poat-Mata, NUS President, NUS President Professor Tan Eng Chai, NUS Alumni Advisory Board members, fellow alumni, colleagues, and students. Good morning and welcome to the NUS120-SG60 Distinguished Panel. We're very thrilled that you are here with us for our NUS120 Homecoming to reconnect with the university as we celebrate both the legacy and the future of NUS and our alumni community. As part of the lineup of events today, we're honored to have with us a few of our distinguished alumni to join us for a discussion on Singapore in a shifting global order, economic ambition and geopolitical realities. As Singapore celebrates its 60th anniversary this year, the country stands out as a powerful example of how a small state can punch above its weight, both economically and geopolitically. Today's discussion will explore Singapore's evolving role on the global stage, looking at the strategies that have contributed to its success while navigating an increasingly uncertain international landscape. I want to thank our panel speakers and moderator for joining us today for what is sure to be an insightful and interesting discussion. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Selina Ho, Vice Dean, Research and Development, Dean's Chair and Associate Professor in International Affairs at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, Danny Quah, Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics at LKYSPP, and Gungwu, University Professor, as well as our moderator, President of the Keith Yap, President of the LKYSPP Alumni Singapore Chapter, and he's also Vice Chairman of Impart and host of the Front Row podcast. Now, before we begin, I would like to thank my colleagues at the NUS Alumni Relations, as well as our student ambassadors for their help in making this event possible. So once again, thank you very much for being here with us today. Please enjoy the session as well as the lunch, which will follow this. Over to Keith, please.
Good morning, everyone. A historian, political scientist, and an economist walks into a bar, but it turns out that it's actually the NUS120 Homecoming. So it's my incredible pleasure and privilege to be sitting here with esteemed scholars, and as an alumni, I find it a treat that I get to moderate this session. So I'm going to start off by getting someone who has seen the death of empires, the birth of nations, and the multiple shifts in global order to answer a very hard question. So, Prof. Wang, one of the most important lessons you have taught many generations of students is that the modern nation state that we see it is a relatively new historical construct. And I wanted to ask you, what is something unique about the notion of the nation states that great power competition fundamentally is different in this era versus the many eras that came before it?
Thank you very much, Keith, for asking me that question. In fact, at this homecoming, I can't help saying that it was on this campus as a freshman in 1949 that I joined a group of young people to talking about nation building. And we were very innocent. We thought that was a wonderful thing to be involved in. We were going to be free from colonial rule, get rid of empires, and we would start building our own nation. At that point, of course, there was no question of a Singapore nation. The nation was the Malaya. The nation was Malaya. Singapore, sooner or later, we would join Malaya. I was not a student of history at that time, didn't know much history. So I didn't know nation was a new concept. But as you say, it was really a historical construct. And it only started about the late 18th century. So it's only 100 odd years old before we as a colonial state was given the chance to nation build. So what were we building? I don't think we were at all clear what we were building. For that time, all we thought was we would inherit this colonial state. And our generation and that those of us who were in that position will be the ones who had to rule this place, run this place, together with Malaya, of course, to run this place when the British left. That was nation building. Sounded very simple. But as you know, going back to the fact that it was a historical concept, there was no concept of nation in this part of the world, least of all a nation state. A nation is difficult enough to define. A nation state was a totally new idea. And I think none of us in the neighborhood or none of us in the Afro-Asian world that were post-colonial knew exactly what we were doing. At that point, essentially, it was simply a question of, given a certain border, a colonial border, drawn up by colonial powers, nothing to do with the locals. They draw up those borders, you inherit the borders, and try to make everybody within those borders member of a nation. And treat them as a nation, and they would be the basis of the people of a nation state. Because that was how it was defined when it was invented in the late 18th century by the French, essentially by the French. That was the idea they put forth. And their idea was very simple, that a nation was every French citizen is a national of France. And we get rid of kings, aristocrats, bishops, priests, and all these people. Every French citizen will be equal in running France. That was the idea of the French Revolution. And coincidentally, just at that point, the Americans were fighting for their independence from Britain. And they were influenced by the French Enlightenment ideas, and they created a nation state with its own constitution, quite independently of the French, but drawing from the idea that everybody, at least all the white men in the 13 colonies across fighting for the independence from Britain would be citizens of the American nation. So that was how it began. There was no such thing as nation states anywhere in the world before that. And what happened basically was after that, all the people in America as well as in Europe were trying to make out how to build a nation. They were themselves going through a nation building process. As you know, in the French case, it wasn't easy. They started the job, and next thing they knew, they killed off all the revolutionaries and produced a Napoleon. I mean, soon after that, Napoleon, who made himself an emperor, and where was the nation? So to them, the nation was France. So the idea that a national pride in a nation, but the rights of the citizens was just forgotten. That's the emperor and Napoleon's family all became the next generation of aristocrats. One of his nephews became an emperor again, Louis, became monarch again. A monarch, Louis Napoleon was actually more or less a king of France. So the French took another 100 years of trying to define what a French nation was. And similarly, in America's case, it was a bit easier because having fought for the independence, what they said was, anything to do with Britain got nothing to do with us. And they tried to create a nation which was separate from those stupid Europeans they didn't want to be involved in. So they developed essentially the Monroe Doctrine of separating them. The American nation got nothing to do with all those European kingdoms, monarchs, archbishoprics, and so on. That was how it began. So I would say that Europeans took another 100 years trying to define what a nation was. And they didn't have an easy time of it. In the end, they created powerful nation states, became national empires. In the name of their nation, they went out to conquer empires of their own. And basically, the world was divided into two major empires, the British and the French Empire, which more or less those two sides agreed to divide the world into half. The British took one half, the French took the other. So nation became involved in empire. They were national empires. What we meant by national empire is different from other feudal empires. Is a national empire is that every member of the officials who ran the empire had to be either a Frenchman or an Englishman or a Dutchman, you know. So only a national can be an official in a national empire. In the feudal empires, that was not the case. So this was completely new, that a national can be an imperialist. So what is a nation state then? A nation can be an empire. Terribly confusing, and Europeans couldn't sort it out. So in the end, what happened was they had to fight it out, and had 2 world wars to fight out which national empire should dominate. The Germans wanted to come in, had a share. The Italians came in. Everybody wanted to have their own piece of a national empire, carve up the world. And so the nation state became an utter, you might say, utter illusion, no such thing. So what happened at the end of World War II was that all those national empires basically self-destructed. And out of it came the United States, which was the most powerful country at the time. And they created, out of their experience, all their attempts to try and bring about peace and avoid war, starting with the League of Nations and all their experiments at trying to work out a peaceful way of solving problems, they created the United Nations. Now this is where this university came in. In 1949 when we started, we're just 4 years old after the United Nations was started. And that was our ideal of a nation state. A nation state was a state that was sovereign and equal. All members of the United Nations states were equal and sovereign, independent, and each one would have 1 vote in the United Nations. It's a wonderful idea. I can tell you, as a young student, we were so excited. We would now become one state, one nation state in that world of nation states. The whole global world order was determined now by a global order of nation states. At that point, at the time the United Nations was established, there were only basically the 50 or so countries that could be described as nation states, mostly in Western Europe, Mediterranean, and Latin America. These are the only nation states. So the rest of us were colonies, protectorates, and other names you can call it, all starting off to build our nations. And what were our models? The model was Europe. The other thing was the reality was we inherited a colonial state, but the model of a nation was that of Europe. But actually, even the Europeans till then weren't actually all that clear what a nation state was. Because although in 1945 there were all those nation states, if you look at the history of from 1945 to the end of the century, how many times European borders changed? In other words, they didn't have fixed borders. But we, in Asia, never heard of nations before, were given the set of borders within which we're supposed to create nations. But the Europeans did it the other way around. They looked around and said, do you belong to my nation or not? And then if you do, then we work out new borders. So new states were created. If you remember the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the breakup of the various empires, including the Tsars, the Russians, and the so-called Holy Roman Empire. All these terms confuse everybody, and in the end, what they were doing was sorting out borders. Do you realize that when the Soviet Union collapsed, it created 13 different new states. Yugoslavia collapsed, became 6 new states. So until very recently, if you watch with our own eyes, they were changing their borders, defining their nation states. And finally, what people came out with, the political scientists very cleverly sorted out, what was the common thing that made a nation state? And they finally saw only 3 things made the basis of the European nation states. 1 language, 1 religion, and a shared history. These were the 3 things that everybody agreed on a nation state had to have. Then we look at ourselves in Southeast Asia, for example, in Asia, in Africa. in which nation state did we have that condition? One language, one religion, and a shared history. The only shared history was with the colonial history, and the borders were drawn. But those borders were drawn with very artificial borders, and the people who were living within the borders came from all sorts of origins. So I gave a bit of history because then you say, what is this global world order? What happened to that? And then we decided, we have learned over the years that that ideal of a sovereign equal, a world of sovereign equal nation states in the United Nations was really an illusion. Because right from the beginning, they recognized that there were power systems, that the American had a power system, and the Russians had Soviets had a power system. And what we already have from the very beginning of the United Nations were two ideological empires. And the Cold War began. So the United Nations began with Cold War, two ideological empires, with two former empires. Now what were they doing there? Why was Britain and France in there? They were, after all, former empires. They were still, in fact, at the point when they joined the United Nations, they were still empires. The British still have imperial possessions for another 40 or 50 years. And if you include some place like Hong Kong, it was not until 1997 that the British could be said to have given up their final colonies. And even the Portuguese had some around. So, and what was Britain as an empire doing as a nation state with security in the Security Council with the veto vote and so on. So from the very beginning, it was not really working as a sovereign equal nation. There were 5 separate nations with a veto power in the Security Council, and they essentially made all the key decisions about war and peace. And in the end, with veto power, as we discovered, the UN became basically dysfunctional. Anything that the United States didn't like, they vetoed it. Russians didn't like, they vetoed it. So no problems are solved until this day. If you look at all the veto powers that have been exercised, we know who have been exercising veto power more than anybody else is the Americans. The Americans have vetoed anything they don't like, they vetoed, and then it could not be done. And so overall, we can say at the end, during the Cold War, we can say there were at least 2 ideological empires to which all the other so-called nation states had to belong, one or the other, or to try and pretend to be neutral, but in essential irrelevant and ineffective. That was the reality. But when the Cold War ended, that created a new problem to the world order. If there's only one sole superpower, as the United States saw itself in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, then when they were sole superpower, what was the world order then? And they still had the veto power, and they had all that power, the military power, the strongest in the world. You can say that it was a virtual American empire as a sole superpower. Everybody was under them. So, I mean, I use these terms. You can see how confusing these terms are. What do they mean? Empire, nation, and is America a nation? So if you look back in the history, it started as a nation with 13 colonies. But from the moment they crossed over the Allegheny Mountains into Louisiana, they took over French colonial territories, they took over other bits of British colonial territories, they took over Spanish territories. What they were doing was they were building an empire. America is actually an American empire to begin with on the continent itself, from the 13 colonies to become the United States of America, was the building of an American empire. Of course, we didn't see it that way because at the same time we can say, because there were no nations, so they were just taking territory from people who were too primitive to know what they were doing. So that was the explanation. But the reality was by the time they reached California and the gold rush and reached the Pacific, there was an American empire on the American continent. Yeah. And so given that background, you can see that today what we're left with is to go back to a situation where the world order is now based on 2 things, wealth and power, which is the oldest things for all of history. Countries and powers and kingdoms and empires have all been built on the question of wealth and power. Are we now back to that? If that is the case, where would nation states in Southeast Asia, which are incidentally still work in progress? There is no nation, even in Southeast Asia, there's no nation that hasn't got a nation building problem right now. All of us have faced that problem because it depends on how you define it. But actually all 10 of us are different in Southeast Asia. Each one of us claims to be a sort of nation state by working at it. And Singapore probably most of all, because we started with the exceptional decision to start with a plural society, recognizing the equality of people who have different origins and neglecting questions of race, religion, and all the other things to create a nation state where everybody was equal. That was not true in all the other countries. None of the 9 other countries share that definition. So in that way already, Singapore is a totally exceptional kind of a nation-building process, work in progress, a future possible nation state. But in the process, Singapore's success has been in fact entirely against the idea of nation state. Singapore's success came out of the fact that from the very beginning it recognized that its future lay in to become a global city. Very soon after Singapore became independent, they saw that they have no future in this region unless they operate globally. And they took advantage of the fact that they were locked into the Anglo-American power system and globalized economic system, that they could actually be part of this global economic enterprise that allowed Singapore to play a part which was separate and be recognized as so important to everybody with that economic interest, that everybody began to realize that using Singapore as a global city was advantageous to everybody else. And as a result, Singapore's success came out of its global city, not because it was a nation state, because it's still working at it. And I'm not sure when it will ever come into being, but I'm pretty certain it is a global city. So when you look at the world order today, is it a world order of a future world order of nation states? Or we will have to redefine nation states, regroup them in all sorts of loose confederations, loose groupings of people to challenge or to deal with the two powerful countries that call themselves nation states. China and United States, they call themselves nation states, but they're actually empire states. They both are derived from two empires. And an American empire that was built in the 19th century, basically, a Chinese empire that is 5,000 years old, which is still, and the territories are even bigger than the original Chinese empire. But that empire has now been redefined as a nation state because they are members of the United Nations as one nation, only one nation. But the size of these two nation states is so, the gap between them and the rest, and the smallest ones for United is so great. And even the so-called middle states and so on, they're nothing compared to the tremendous wealth and power that these two states have, so-called nation states, America and China. They are so-called, I would say, so-called nation states. But are they really nation states? That is a big question mark. So all these terms need to be redefined. So the shifting global order actually has to re-examine all the concepts that we have been using all this time, the language and the rhetoric that we have been using, all can be challenged. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, thank you.
That's gave him an impossible task, and he managed to fly above and beyond. And that's what NUS is all about, passing the test with flying colors. So in 19 minutes, Prof. Wang really compressed 200 years of history into 19 minutes. And it is our task as students and alumni to explore that question with the rest of our lives. One of the very interesting things that you point out, is just focus on the tangent, is that right now we're seeing maybe the re-emergence of virtual empires, maybe through the US and China. And you talk about wealth and power being the two main dimensions in which they will affect the global order. Naturally, I have to turn this question to an economist, right? Wealth and power, has to be measured maybe through economic terms. to Prof. Quah, my question would then be, if you look at the current changing economic realities of the world, right? Are we really entering into this era of great power rivalry? Is the era of multilateralism, as many people would put it, dead? I'll leave you to answer that question in 10 minutes, hopefully.
Okay. Thank you, Keith. Prof. Wang, that was an amazing discourse they've just given us on 200 years of world history. Partly in response, I want to just make 3 points by way of answer to your question. The third point that I'm going to talk about is the current state of the global economy and Singapore's place in it in particular, because that's something of great interest to us. The first 2 points, I want to refer to the United States and the system, the order that it tried to build, what its principles are, and how we in Singapore and this region operate within it. And the second point is to try and do the same thing with China as the center of that operating system. How does Singapore and other smaller economies operate within that system? But to ground this discussion, I want to not take us back 200 years, but I want to remind ourselves that there was a time 50, 60 years ago when world order was very simple as far as Singapore was concerned. It was expressed most eloquently by the founding Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. He said, you should think about the world as one where there are big fish, and the big fish, if kept unchecked, will eat small fish. Similarly, if kept unchecked, small fish will eat even smaller fish. And if kept unchecked, the smaller fish and the small fish and the big fish will all want to eat shrimp. Singapore is the size of shrimp. And the way Singapore navigates this dangerous world order is that Singapore has to become a poisonous shrimp. That was the conception of the global system of world order. And it's one that's grounded in what many people, scholars, will think of as realism. Singapore has to be a poisonous shrimp so that anyone who even thinks about eating it will find it awkward, if not fatal to them. They will keep away. And remember, that was stated at a time when world order was much more sharply defined. It was a time when John F. Kennedy described how humanity was on the last final twilight struggle between democracy and freedom on the one hand, and totalitarianism and tyranny on the other. That was a time when the Soviets had nuclear missiles, positioning them as close to the United States as Cuba at one point. That was the time when there was Indo-China conflict and the Vietnam War on our doorstep here in Southeast Asia. That was the time when China was broadcasting communist propaganda from Kunming into all of Southeast Asia, where Southeast Asia saw movements like the Chinese middle school students in Singapore, trade unions across the region, expressing dissatisfaction with the current system. And that was the time when it was clear China was a dangerous nation, not just through the broadcasts of communist propaganda, but to what it was doing to its own people. Millions of people died in China in the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forwards, through purges, turmoil in cities. It was a dangerous world. And Singapore and all others who were wise should become like poisonous shrimp. And the choice was very clear. The United States offered freedom, rule of law, international systems that professed stability and offered economic prosperity. And the other side, to the extent there was another side, well, it was unclear. It was chaos. Okay. Today, we operate in a very different world. And so when you say to me, Keith, how do we view the two or other great powers, and how does Singapore or other similar nations navigate that? We need a new rule book, because it's not anymore humanity's twilight struggle between democracy and freedom and totalitarianism. We are seeing prosperity operating in different ways. There are rules of the marketplace, and there's manipulation of rules of the marketplace. So Singapore, while it must continue to have that poisonous shrimp idea about it in terms of security, needs to also think, what more should it do? So to do this, it needs to recognize what other nation states, the great powers, want to do, because Singapore's prosperity, economic prosperity, is built on engagement with the rest of the world. And there's a limited extent to which poisonous shrimp, while keeping us safe, can also generate economic prosperity. Can or cannot. So we need to think about what the operating system and rules are. If we compare what the two great powers are, what Prof. Wang you refer to as the massive empires, they are too large for us to even imagine, say China and the United States. To the extent that both of them want to be leaders of the world, each in their own way, they actually share a common set of goals, which is to bring stability and prosperity to the world. It's no good if you are the leader of a world that's burning down, right? If a world that's not prosperous, you do not generate any rent for yourself. Whatever leader the world wants to be of any future conceptualized world order, it wants stability and prosperity, but it also wants legitimacy. And here, to the extent that we think about there being a contest between different versions, different visions of world order, how each side attracts legitimacy from the rest of us, Singapore and other small states, that's where the sharp difference is. It's not that they want to burn up the world. That's no longer the case. Kennedy might have imagined that at a time when the Soviet Union was brandishing nuclear weapons, but that's not the situation today. China was a dangerous nation, but that's no longer the situation in the same way today. So if nations, whatever putative leaders, want stability and legitimacy, how do they attract it? Prof. Wang, you began with the United Nations, and even going back, the League of Nations. Those were conceptions where all nations were going to be equal, and there was a community of nations that would be led by the consent of the governed and organized by the collective opinion of humanity. The League of Nations tried to do that. The United Nations continues to try and do that. Where we've got a challenge is that that's not all to world order. World order has these nation states, empire states, who want to be leaders, who want to be hegemonic. So America has a vision about how it will be hegemonic. Okay, and this is both pre-Trump and potentially after Trump. America does acknowledge, Prof. Wang, what you call empire, the American empire, or what in maybe more acceptable terms was called the American century. And the American century was characterized by an America that offered benevolent hegemony, but it was self-confessed and genuinely believed to be the leader of the world. Okay. That is the American vision. That's the American vision of world order. There will be rules, there will be liberal set of ideas, but make no mistake, America is the leader of that world. America has a universalist vision on liberal values, which we might accept because they seem reasonable, but it's got a universalist values. The second plank of the American empire is that it offers economic efficiency. So if you're a small business anywhere in the world, you can step up and be a profitable business You are part of the story of economic efficiency. You are part of the American empire. America offered at one time the idea of economic efficiency carried across nations, constructed global value chains, used ideas of comparative advantage. All nations could be part of that. That was the vision of the American empire. And all of that, because of America's approach to universalist values, came with the implicit assumption that eventually all of you will be like it. That was the idea of political convergence. When Bill Clinton argued for opening up China, accepting China into the international system, one of the ideas that drove him and his administration was the idea of political convergence, formulated by a Harvard political scientist and sociologist that said that as all countries develop, they will eventually approach the kind of liberal democracy that America is in. So my first point, world order as imagined by America, pre-Trump and potentially, even with the slight today's disruption, potentially post-Trump, is not necessarily a bad vision. If you're willing to accept American leadership, and if you're willing to accept the notion of political convergence and a universalist approach to values. In Asia, we have not always been friendly to those ideas, because we have thought that economic development came first, liberal values on speech and freedom would have to come later, but we often disagreed with the United States. But America would turn around and say, well, that's for the future. Right now, you're on the path of political convergence. So all of this was a story that we told ourselves, that the generation that continued to believe in poisonous shrimp accepted America on. Today, the challenge is America no longer, at least for now, no longer believes many of those virtues that I've described to you, not just the US leadership part, that it wants to continue to hold, but all the rest of it. Economic efficiency, comparative advantage, everybody having a place. It's now a different world. We can get in the Q&A to how exactly that's different, but let me make my second point and then third point quickly, if I may, Keith. If that is America's vision, and I say that all great powers for enlightened self-interest want the world to be prosperous and stable, how is China's vision different? Decades ago, the way America, in fact, decades ago, under Trump 1.0, the way Mike Pompeo, the US Secretary of State, described China, it was that China did not view a world that was stable and prosperous. That China was a revisionist power that would seek to exercise veto authority on the economic, political, and social choices of those smaller than it. The opposite of America, but an opposite of America that harked back to the John F. Kennedy and Cold War era. China's vision is quite different from both of those extremes. It is today a superpower with sharp elbows that it does not always realize. It takes actions that aggravates those of us who are smaller states, and it doesn't always recognize that. Having said that, it professes not to be interested in hegemony. It professes to say it is not interested in being a leader of the world or of any grouping that it will impose its will on. Instead of there being a single leader, China's vision of world order is that of diffused polarity. There can be multiple poles of leadership, but we will all work together in organizations like the SCO, BRICS Plus, and the rest of this. It is diffused. Having made that sharp distinction from America's vision, and then we, Singapore and the rest of the small states, have to figure out where we fit in that. It's also after economic efficiency. It wants to trade with the world. It values not the same set of liberal values that America professes, but it says, let's focus on development, achieving prosperity, win-win outcomes. That is what it professes. We know that in the event, what a great power professes can be different from what it actually does. But I'm making this judgment of America and China based on what their stated rules of a vision for the world is. Now, if there's a leadership, whether reluctant or self-professed, from either of those, there must be followers. So we're the followers. We, by we, I mean the rest of the world, 80% of humanity. Like Prof. Wang, you say, we're all middle powers at best. We do not challenge either the United States nor China across from a nuclear battlefield. What do we want? We can sign up to the prosperity and stability part, but then everybody says they want that. That's not a reason to separate the two. So let me say, we want three things, and then let me finish. We want a level playing field. If you want to be a leader, at least allow economics to operate on a level playing field. Don't boss it over us. Because if you do, small states like Singapore and others will not achieve the economic prosperity that is due to us from our economic efficiency, which all of you great leaders profess. Let there be a level playing field. Let there be a commitment to peaceful dispute resolution through diplomacy. We do not want to stand across from a battlefield from you. Prosecuting violence is an economic activity that shows increasing returns to scale. The larger you are, the better you are at it. It is not fair to decide a world based on violence. We want a level playing field with peaceful dispute resolution and a commitment to cooperation to solve the great challenges of our time, the global climate crisis, pandemic, the zombie apocalypse, invasion from Mars. We want everyone to be unified on solving the great global challenges. Now, you give us this, we'll be happy because we will be able to achieve prosperity for our people. We will be safe because it's peaceful dispute resolution, and we will be able to come together to solve the great challenges of our time. However world order evolves, I've given you two visions. The rest of us, the 80% of the world that's not the United States or China, need to insist on these three principles of multilateralism: a level playing field, peaceful dispute resolution, commitment to cooperation. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. Economically, everything is in disruption. We know that Trump has announced Liberation Day tariffs. They're called retaliatory tariffs in some of the language. It is difficult to figure out what the response of the rest of the world has been because every day they change. Sometimes America will say one thing, the next day it'll say another thing. Sometimes the same morning that it says one thing, the party that it signed an agreement with that afternoon will say the complete opposite. There is great chaos. And it is very difficult to make long-term economic decisions, investment, growth, and governance in such an environment. Yes, there are grand visions that work for world order, but I think for today, 2025, all we want is a bit of stability that allows us to formulate our economic plans. Happy to go into detail with you. Thank you all for your attention.
Once again, he's achieved the impossible. So now I'll pass on the next impossible question to Prof. Ho. I think she is also, in true form, brought some slides as well, so some of you can relive your times as students. I think from Prof. Wang and Prof. Danny, we've heard a little bit about the changing global order, and we heard from an economist and historian. So we're going to ask the political scientists, a Southeast Asian political scientist, to take us through what's your take on the changing global order from your lens, and where does Singapore fit in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Keith, and thank you, Prof. Wang and Prof. Quah for setting the stage. It's a real pleasure to be here to see so many fellow alumni. I'm a proud NUS alumni many years ago, so very happy to be in your company. Let me just say that my remarks will be divided into two portions, essentially. One is to respond to some of the things that Prof. Wang and Prof. Quah has said. about the order transition that we're actually going through. The second part of it will be on what Singapore can do moving forward. So let me bring, Prof. Wang so eloquently put together that long history of world order. So what actually are we looking at right now? So let me bring it to the present. What are we looking at right now? And how should we look forward in the next 10 to 20 years? So as we all know, we are not just in a power transition, but we're actually in an order transition, moving from a bipolar world during the Cold War, which some of us will be familiar with, and the unipolar moment after the 1990s during the post-Cold War era, where most of us grew up in. Now, the thing is, what we are looking at now is something that's very unfamiliar for us who have grown up in the 20th century. We are growing up in a time where power transition, order transition is protracted. It's going to be long. And it's going to be uncertain, it's going to be unstable, it's going to last for 10 to 20 decades. Now, why is that the case? Well, we have a United States that actually undergirded most of world order during the Cold War, and then in the unipolar moment, or what Prof. Wang referred to as American Empire. But the United States, as we know, and which Prof. Quah also said, is undergoing tremendous changes, and which, in the shape of things to come, we don't really know, right? But I'm actually more, you used the word potentially, Danny, when referring to the next administration after Trump. I would say that we are locked in. We are locked in into a path where America is going to be continuing being inward looking. The forces that have been unleashed, the forces that have been latent for a long time in American society, is now out in the open. And there's no putting it back. It's already out there. Pandora's box is open. So the next president that you're going to see, whether from the left or from the right, is going to be someone who will have to follow that path. Maybe in a more polite manner, in the way that Biden was. But Biden was also inward-looking, America first. The domestic sentiments in the United States will not allow an internationalist precedent in the form of, say, for example, Obama to come into being again. It will be an inward-looking president, a America first president, and it will be the case for at least the foreseeable 10 to 20 years, unless something else happens. Now, and then China, we are in an era where China is not ready yet. It has its own idea of what the world should be. It is definitely a regional power. It is also a global power, but it is not ready to take over the leadership role of the entire world. And not only is it not ready, I'm not sure the rest of the world is also ready for it to take on global leadership. Now, this is not to say that China should not have its own place in the system. It should have, commensurate with its power, with its economic power in particular. China should have a leadership role. But being the key leader, the top leader, that's a question mark. Now, so if we have two great powers, two superpowers actually, who are not ready to take on leadership roles, what does that mean? It means that the world will be, the kind of order that we're going to see in the future, the global order, the regional order, is going to be one that is most likely going to be multipolar. Okay? What you're actually seeing now, middle powers, smaller powers, actually scrambling to have a say in what this new order is going to be. That's why you see a lot of activism in regional groupings like ASEAN. You see a lot of activism that's going on with middle powers trying to do something about the emerging technologies in very niche areas, in international law, in multilateral settings. These are all efforts by what the rest of us, which Prof. Wang was saying just now about when in the colonial times, we don't have, or rather in the Cold War, we were new nation states. We have no say in how the world was going to come about. We are still in nation building. I think we are, all of us are. But we are much stronger than we were before. Middle powers, smaller states, post-colonial states are a lot stronger than what we were before. In other words, we have the resources to have a say in how the new order will come about. But then, therefore, we're going to see probably a new world order that will emerge that will not have a single or even two hegemonic states undergirding it. You'll see a series of poles, different middle powers. China, US will have a seat for sure, but you might have Europe, you have Japan, you have other countries that will be part of these poles. And ASEAN is also aiming to be one of these poles. Southeast Asia is. So as we go through this transition, it will be protracted. It will be one that will last for 10 to 20 years because of the way the nature of power is. It's much more diffused. Now, so what should Singapore do in this kind of situation? We are used to working in an American-centric world, but we are also actually used to working in a Sino-centric world. The kind of adjustments that we have to make is not totally impossible, insurmountable. We want to have a place in the world, to have a say in how our region will look like and how the global order will look like. So there are three things that we can do. Yes, we are concerned, and we're not like the West. We don't think of China as a military threat. I think most of us in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular, don't think of China as a military threat. We think of China as an economic boon for us in the region. Now, we are concerned because of South China Sea issues and the potential of what China could be, but by and large, we're used to living in China, and we will live with China, continuing to do that. So we cannot be neutral. We will take stands, choose sides when necessary. Second point, we need to continue to uphold multilateralism and the rules-based order, because that is the protection for small states. Now, we need to uphold free trade, because that's the nature of our economy. Now, Singapore, together with the rest of ASEAN countries, we are the driver of the RCEP. We are also one of the founding members of the CPTPP, and we need to drive towards the implementation of these agreements. Now, these multilateral agreements are actually the antithesis of protectionism and tariffs. They can act as stabilizing force on the ongoing tariff wars, and collective action through these platforms should be a priority. And we should continue to work with other regions in the world to build up these global value chains and advance trade. Second, we need to continue pushing forward in setting standards, rules, and ethical principles on the use of AI, emerging technologies, as well as the digital economy. Now, we have something called DEFA, right? Digital Economy Framework Agreement within ASEAN. We launched negotiations for that 2 years ago in 2023, and we should continue to advance towards an ASEAN digital economy. We also have DEPA, the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement. This is the first of its kind. We work together with Chile, Singapore worked together with Chile and New Zealand on this. Now, we need to do this. We need to continue upholding rules-based order multilateralism. Now, we need to also strengthen ASEAN, the third point I have. ASEAN and ASEAN resilience. Let me quote from some of our leaders in Singapore. In May 2024, then Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong said, and I quote, "Regional resilience is as important as national resilience. Regional resilience for South Asia means ASEAN. We have to keep on building this up, contributing to it, and playing our part, even though we are a very small member of ASEAN." Okay, unquote. Now, in April this year, Singapore Prime Minister Lawrence Wong said Singapore, and I quote, "can chart its own path, its own course, and with courage, foresight, and skill, and meet the monsoon winds." We enjoy some of that right now, actually, with the squall and all that that's going on, that are heading our way. Now, a key part of this charting our own course involves championing, and I quote again, "stronger ASEAN integration and building an open and inclusive regional architecture." You see where we are going here. We're looking at ASEAN. Those of you in the last couple of years, if you travel a lot, you might notice actually at Changi Airport, there's now an ASEAN and APEC lane. We didn't used to have that, right? So this is where we're heading in terms of our foreign policy. ASEAN is really an underrated platform. Now, I want to be very realistic about this. ASEAN has serious limitations, but it is not as weak as we make it out to be. By and large, all these years of working together in ASEAN meetings have created a regional identity. And this is where I'm going to show my slides. 3 tables of a survey that I did in May 2023, and this article has just been published in one of the journals earlier this year. 3 tables from that article. So this is a survey of elite respondents from 6 Southeast Asian countries. Now, you can ask me why these South Asian countries. There's a reason for it, but I have no time to explain it. But basically, you can see the countries up there. Now, look at that. When asked which is the most influential country or organization in Southeast Asia, meaning region-wide, top answer is ASEAN. Okay, over more than 50% said ASEAN. And if you look by country, only Thailand said China. Interesting, huh? We can dissect these results later on if you want to ask me. Next slide, please. Okay, even more interesting, look at what Singapore's answer is. Okay, most influential country or organization in the respondent's country, meaning within your own country, not region-wide Southeast Asia. Still, ASEAN is top. Some slight variation, Thailand and Singapore choosing China. But as you see, China actually consistently do pretty well. But ASEAN is always tops, right? Okay, the next slide, please. Table 4 of my paper. Now, so the elites overwhelmingly identified with ASEAN. When asked which is the most important which country or organization you most identify with by country, overwhelmingly more than 80% says ASEAN. Even Thailand now says ASEAN. Now this tells you that there is a regional identity that is based on ASEAN. ASEAN is a strength. ASEAN is a strength. And it is where I think you can see that that these are actually, you can think of them as aspirations. Okay, so a lot of these surveys actually are sometimes, depending on how you ask the question, some of these questions are about aspirations. The aspirations is really there for a stronger ASEAN. Why is that? Because small states are protected in an organization like this. We can have, we multiply our voices when we talk as a group, okay? And it shelters us from great power that trying to, if we have to deal with them one by one. Now, we do aspire to a stronger collective ASEAN. But obviously, we are not perfect. We need to do a lot more. And Singapore will be ASEAN chairman in 2027. So I have a wish for Singapore to do 2 things in ASEAN. First, we need to strengthen ASEAN's conflict prevention and mitigation system. I think we do very well in trade. We have RCP, we have CPTPP, we have a lot of FTAs, but we are very weak in conflict prevention and mitigation. We have existing platforms that have not been fully utilized. And we can see what happened recently with Thailand and Cambodia border dispute. Now, that was a huge setback for ASEAN. Malaysia took a very positive step by deploying a peace monitoring task force. Now, can we have an ASEAN peace monitoring task force, not just a Malaysian one? Secondly, we need to enhance cross-regional collaboration. And for instance, Malaysia, again, initiated ASEAN GCC, Gulf Cooperation Countries, Gulf Countries Cooperation China Summit this year under its chairmanship. Can we enhance cross-regional integration between ASEAN and EU, between ASEAN and MERCOSUR and Pacific Alliance in Latin America? There's a lot more we can do. So these are my suggestions for ASEAN. So let me conclude by saying that Singapore is actually in a very strong position. Like I said right at the beginning, we're used to working with Americans. So there's a little bit of pain if we have to adjust to a different type of world order. But we're also used to living with China. We have strong ties, family ties, ethnic ties, cultural ties. And our leaders have spent many years cultivating Chinese leaders. So I think that we are actually in a very good position. Power is a lot more diffuse now. Nations are stronger now. We are not weak colonial states as before. So power is much more diffuse. We are not so weak as before, and we can choose. We don't have to choose per se to take either sides, but we can choose to how we want things to be, to have our say in the global order to come. We diversify our networks, friends, trade, and global supply chain. So let me sum up by saying that we can do three things. One is we cannot stay neutral. We have to actively choose. Secondly, we need to uphold multilateralism and the rules-based order. Thirdly, we need to build ASEAN and ASEAN resilience. Thank you very much. Back to you, Keith.
Yeah, thank you. With that, we now transit into like the Q&A segment. So before we go into that, I'll just quickly wrap up what I believe to be a tour de force of mini lectures by three of our esteemed scholars here. And it's also an encouragement for you to, perhaps purchase some NUS press books, if you want to further your studies outside the office hours, if one might put it. So Prof. Wang started us off, I think, with the biggest historical fact, which is that what we're seeing today, especially with the rise of US and China, it's actually two empires dressing up as nation state. That's a historical fact that we need to contend with. And we're starting to see a transition, and I think Prof. Quah spent a lot of time unpacking it for us, of our transition into this multipolar world. And what us smaller nations want, right, is three things: a level playing field, peace, and cooperation. And where Singapore stands actually it dovetails perfectly with what Prof. Ho talked about, that Singapore must be an active chooser, so we don't be neutral, don't just stand there. We must actively choose and do what's aligned with our interests. And I think that's something many policymakers, I recently spoke to Ambassador Chan, she said the same thing, right? It's about actively choosing what's in your interest. One fact that's very interesting is Singapore is the largest source of FDI for China, but America is the largest source of FDI for Singapore. So that's one example of us actively choosing, right? Second thing is embracing multilateralism. And the third thing is a very concrete example of the second point, which is that you really want to build ASEAN up. She has two aspirations for us in ASEAN 2027 when we take up the chair: improve our conflict resolution and mitigation, and also further enhance regional collaboration. So with my very pithy summary, I'd like to open the floor up to questions. There are a few questions here already before, that kind of like been selected and curated. And what I'll do is maybe get one of the panelists to kind of lead the answer, and then the other panelists can chime in. Maybe I'll go to Prof. Ho first. One of the questions I asked whether Singapore can balance between the US and China indefinitely. So it goes back to your point about actively choosing, right? Will there actually come a point where they're like, it's very hard for you to actively choose on your interests? Will there be conditions that emerge that will prevent you from actively choosing? If so, how can we prevent that from happening? Yeah.
I think Danny has an answer for that too, Danny. Just called Tai Chi. But Danny, has been talking about in our private conversations, who has been saying that if you want us to choose, you may not like the answer. Did you find out who said that?
The record shows that it was Ambassador Chan Heng-chi, who in Washington, D.C. 14 years ago told American diplomats, stop asking us to choose because you might not like the answer we will give you. Fareed Zakaria is on record in some of his writings and in his book, attributing to an unnamed Southeast Asian leader that same phrase and that same wording. Many people assumed that it was PM Lee that Fareed was referring to. But I have asked ChatGPT and DeepSeek to scour through all of their writings, and they come back and say this is not a phrasing that PM Lee actually ever used, at least in any kind of writing or publication. I was at Shangri-La Dialogue where many people thought he said that. He didn't say that. His article in Foreign Affairs, many people thought he said that. He actually didn't say that there either. So in terms of the geeky scholarly activity that Selina and I do during the work week, we have tracked it down
Private conversations, by
to
the
Chan
way.
Heng Chi. Chan Heng Chi, your interlocutor, Keith, is the one responsible for that phrase. But having said that, that is a sentiment that I think all of us feel powerfully. And I thought that Selina described it really well, that the domain of choice for us is not the binary between America and China. The domain of choice is who are we going to trade with? Who do we form relations with? Where are we going to invest? Where are the people that we're talking to about forming groupings for digital agreements, green economy? So it's those things that actually matter in our day-to-day.
Yeah, but let me also add, I think that we, like I said, we can actively choose in our interests, but we don't have to choose between the US and China. But the question that is coming here is about choosing between the US and China and the conditions when we have to do that. So unless we reach that situation where there's a conflict, open conflict like this war, and where something that really will strangle the life source of our economy, I think we still have plenty of reason not to choose and plenty of room not to choose.
All right, maybe I'll ask a follow-on question for Prof. Wang. In your course of studying history, you've seen many small middle powers learn how to navigate the changing global orders, as one might put it. What are some of the lessons that you think current generation or future generations of Singapore leaders will do well to heed?
I'm not quite sure I got quite a question.
So what are the lessons of history that you think a small state like Singapore should learn from history? Are there any examples from history that we should try to reference or learn from?
Well, I think many of the points made by Professor Quah and Professor Ho are relevant to this, that when you're a small state, you've got to be very nimble or poisonous or whatever, so that you're able to move very freely. You cannot be stuck with anything. If you are, then you're just a dependency. You're a vassal state or whatever it is. If you don't want to be that, if you want to have some agency, then you have to learn how to operate in the most realistic way possible. That means being alert, and all the points that have been made, I think I'm already very clear. The multilateralism, the sense of reaching out beyond your neighborhood, as I say, a global city approach, which has been extremely successfully. I think Singaporeans probably don't fully realize how successful Singapore has been as a global city. I mean, as a nation state, yes, it's not a model for anybody. As a nation state work in progress, because you asked me to approach it that way, that has too early to say. We also don't know. And it probably doesn't matter as much. The work has to continue. But the real success is to be alert to the whole global order and constantly be willing to change and adapt according to the situation as it changes. And I think whether it's regional order like ASEAN or multiple organizations, in a way I'm very struck by the fact that Singapore joins almost everything. Everything that Singapore can join, we join. But I think that makes very good sense to me. That's probably the best way out, is to join everything so that you're always there to learn, to know what is happening, and how much you want to be involved or not involved. You make the judgment, but you have to join to know what is happening. So there's no point being exclusive in any way at all. So this multilateral approach, joining everything, thinking globally all the time, seemed to me the underlying thing that almost explains so much of Singapore's success.
Yeah, we're not yet in BRICS, so maybe we'll talk about that later if there's a question that emerges. Maybe what I'll do is, rather than go to the pigeonhole, let's have a more lively discussion. I'll open the floor up to questions. I think there are mics standing around, so if you can raise your hand, we'll get some of the mic runners to come to you. Yeah, we have one there. And then just feel free to say your name. If you don't want to say your class, just say which faculty you're from if you don't want to reveal your age.
Hi, I'm Yok Ling from LKYSPP MPM 2019. So it's a defunct course already program. and I'm here for Prof. Daddy Quah. Yeah. So, but today's my question is actually directed to Prof. Selina. So, I was actually at a podcast, on the panel of a podcast a few weeks ago with Mr. Koh Bak Song, and after the podcast discussion, so the founder actually asked about this prospect of having an ASEAN currency. So both Mr. Koh and we said no. We don't think that's a good idea. But let's hear from Prof. Selina to the question, the answer to that.
I don't think that's something that we can do. Not like the euro, right? This is too much about sovereignty. So I mean, I don't know what else to say, but except that I agree with you. That's not something that's even on the works or in the plan. We have so many other economic things that we can do for integration. Like, we are only trading with each other 25%. We can do a lot more before we even talk about common currency. A common currency will require a common market and things like that, which the EU has been able to do. So I don't think this is even on the cards. Yeah.
So I guess the follow-up question would be, if we're currently at 25%, how do we bring it up to 35%? What's the next kind of steps that we need to do to bring it on the next bound? Obviously, I have to point to the economists, right?
First, thank you, Yuk-Ling and Selina and Keith, for adding on to that question. So I might say three things. The first is that a lot of the economic research and the technical literature pointed to how, if you are the same currency, you trade a lot more. So I think what Selina and Keith are onto is something very important. So there are actually very creative studies, including those by my friend Andy Rose at the business school, who documented how between the Canada and US border, cities that were actually very close to each other physically, because they use a different currency, trade less than US cities that were further apart. So that was used by many of those in Europe as an argument for creating a single currency. So my first point is that it has the potential of increasing trade. My next 2 points are not so positive. So the first thing to say there is that the euro, while it began with huge pomp and circumstance and great fanfare, has not necessarily turned out to be an unalloyed success. What people discovered was that between Germany and Greece, their economies were so different that having a single currency actually led to tensions within each of these countries and across them. And that showed up as a dramatic worsening after the 2008 global financial crisis. It became the 2010 euro sovereign debt crisis because of the restrictions placed on there being a single currency between Germany, a very strong industrialized economy, and Greece, not a very strong industrialized economy. So I think about the differences that we have across the 10 nation states in ASEAN at this point, the sharp differences between our different economies. So that makes me worry. Then my final point is, as you know, Donald Trump realizes that the US currency has been a great pillar of US strength in the world. And he is so convinced of that idea that the instant he hears talk of other currencies attempting to be strengthened, broadened, regionalized, he goes into action and he raises tariffs on them even more. So at least for the short term, Selina and I disagree with how long the Trump effect is going to last. At least for the short term, this will probably draw unnecessary attention. And as others have said, we have many, many more other economic things that require more greatly urgent in ASEAN to fix. But thank you for the question. Really interesting idea.
All right. Anyone else? All right. We have one there just in front of you. Yeah, there was just one there. Yeah. We can go back to back. No worries.
Hi. I'm Casey Low, computer science 90, long time ago. My question is a bit of history. Prof. Wang says about the nation-state building start in French Revolution, but I want to ask about how does the Westphalia system impact sovereignty, independence, integrity, and all that, territorial integrity? Westphalia system, Westphalia Accord signed maybe 200 years before the French Revolution between Holland, Spain, and all that, where they draw up the territories and sovereignty. How does that impact all those? And we also talk about, I think Prof. Danny Quah says that each superpower has professed ideas. And we know that for the West, for example, maybe sort of governed by this Westphalia system. And we also talk about China being thousands of years of civilization. But remember, all those thousands of years, they are 天下朝贡体系. So eventually, maybe down the road, are we facing a Westphalia system versus a 天下朝贡体系? And if that's the case, how should we choose then? Thank you.
All right, we'll take another question and then we'll put it together. You have one more there?
Thank you. I'm Xing Tian from FASS, I think with many of our speakers. My question is on, in Singapore, although we have the advantage of having Chinese connection, but I think that's also a point of potential fear, because we also want to distinct ourselves from China. And we're also facing increasing, I feel, conflicts with the new immigrants, also with working with China or Chinese business. So I wonder, how do we reconcile with the fear and the conflicts and actually working more with China? Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe the first question on the future of the different world orders, right? The two possible conceptions, maybe the Westphalian one versus maybe a return to imperial China. Prof. Wang, would you like to take that question?
See, I'm not sure that either United States or China are looking back to old systems. I think they are, in a way, looking for a new system in which they could function more effectively. So they're not trying to reconstruct anything. I think at the moment, for example, if I may put it very bluntly, Trump is not expressing just his own opinion. I think it is a general American opinion about making America great again. This is a straightforward nationalistic. It comes back to nationalism, whether we like it or not. When Make America Great Again, it's not very different from making China great again, because in a way China has been doing that ever since the Qing dynasty collapsed, and China went down the hill very rapidly for a long time, and desperately tried to rescue the country. And they've been trying to make China great again since at least Deng Xiaoping came in, and they've been much more successful than anybody expected. But behind it all, you can see that everything that they've succeeded in doing, they want to make great again. China had fallen, make China great again. United States feel that their power has slipped away. They're no longer as feared or respected as before. They want to make America great again in a new way. But I suspect that both of them want to find a new way of doing it. How to do it without being just competing all the time and fighting each other, and maybe even consider, I'm sure Xi Jinping and Trump also think, is there some way they can do it without actually fighting each other, but do it side by side, and respecting each other's method? I'm not sure. But all I think of is that they're not looking to the past, to my knowledge. They are trying to create a new system. And this, in a way, what worries me is that both those reasons for creating a new system comes from a nationalistic, make America great again kind of principle, which both sides actually share. And that, to me, comes back to this question of this nation becoming an empire. All these words are actually words coming from the Western European experience, nation and empire. But the thing is that the two words are almost, nowadays, in terms of those two powers, inseparable. I find it very difficult to separate empire and nation when I talk about China or the United States, simply because they're so big and they are so wealthy and so powerful. There's nobody else in the rest of the world, no other nation, anybody near what these two are like. I mean, some people say Japan, but Japan is not in that position, to my mind. So these are the only two. And because of that, they can afford to actually neglect everybody else's wishes and seek to work out a system that suits them best. And in a funny sort of way, in some ways, they are converging. Because when you look at what Trump says about making America great and what Xi Jinping says, the underlying sentiment behind it is not that different. And it's only a question of their goals being not the same. Each one wants a bit more. But they don't want to fight each other. I'm pretty certain about that. They don't want to destroy each other by fighting each other. They want to do it by not fighting each other, but getting, I want a bigger share, let's put it that way. In any new system, I want to have a bigger share so that I be safer, more secure, more respected, and more admired by everybody. And each one of them would like to have that. But how to work out the proportions of that share is what I think they are trying to negotiate. This is how at least I'm hopeful that this is that's the limit to what their ambitions are.
Thank you, Prof. So to the second question, I'll have to direct it to Prof. Ho. You do a lot of research with regards to China and collaboration with other countries. So could you help us answer that question?
Okay, but maybe there's a Treaty of Westphalia question there, and how that relates to the French Revolution. I think you can think of the Treaty of Westphalia as the modern international system, meaning that how is the international system created based on sovereignty, equality of states. Now, the French Revolution, of which Prof. Wang was talking about, is about the nation building within a country. It's about domestically a nation state. So it is about how there should be equality and for all citizens of the French Republic, and doing away with monarchy and everything. So the French Revolution is really more of a domestic nation state building. With Treaty of Westphalia is the architecture of the international system. So there are two levels here. So that's a quick answer. The question on China and being close to it, and yet there's this tension because in IR theory we talk about identity, national identity, a nation's identity, an individual's identity. So that is a question of public policy, a governance issues, and which is an issue that the government of the day needs to deal with. Okay, so I'm not going to be able to provide you with a full answer, but so this is how you should. It is a balancing act. It's how you bring these people in. How do you integrate them into our societies? That's a question for public policy.
All right. With that, okay. Maybe what we can do is we can go for one last question, and then I don't want to hold you back from lunch because I have the organizers staring at me already. No, I'm just kidding. They are not. They are pleasant people.
I'm Bo Tiong, Sociology of 65. You come here, you walk through the upper quadrangle, you see the CLT, that's where we had our lectures. My question is this: is Singapore an Asian society or nation, or Western society of Asian, from the viewpoint of Singaporeans and non-Singaporeans?
All right. Here I'll be democratic. Maybe any of the panelists, you want to take that up? Sounds like a very difficult question.
Okay, so let me take a stab at that. This is a hugely important question. It's a very large question. But before I answer, let me also say that while I was born and grew up in this part of the world, I've spent a lot of my life in the West. In America, where I went to university, and then in London, where I was there for a long time before coming back here 10 years ago. So I've tried to understand Singapore is post-Asian, but it's not Western. It's post-Asian in the sense that it came up with Asian roots. It is profoundly Asian in its trajectory, but it's also gotten to a point where the ideas that mill about here are ideas that you would find recognizable anywhere in the world. So it's not, I'm not saying that it's cosmopolitan, I'm saying that it's past that, it's post-Asian. And in that sense, it actually is uniquely placed to take on the right kind of intellectual leadership in the world. The world needs to get away from long-standing binaries, East and West, democracy versus authoritarianism or communism, capitalism versus socialism. The world of 9 billion people, the most prosperous parts of the world of 9 billion people out there, most successful, the most peaceful, are the ones that go past these binaries and use the best ideas as earnestly and as genuinely as they can. Because these are societies that have built great universities like ours, who constantly analyze what works and what doesn't work, willing to take on the history that they are proud of, but at the same time are happy to shed ideas that no longer work. That's what I mean by post-Asian. So that's how I think that this is a journey for all of us in this part of the world going forwards. Thank you.
All right. With that, actually, I would say that perhaps captures Prof. Danny Quah's closing remark there captures maybe the ideal of Singapore and NUS. That Singapore offers value in its synthesis. And perhaps that's what NUS at its best also represents. So obviously now I have to ask our three esteemed guests to round up. We're at NUS120, this is a homecoming. If we were to look forward to the rest of the years ahead of us, right? Maybe can you give us some advice? What does it take for us to keep that love for learning alive, even as we continue to travel through the journeys of life? Maybe I'll start with the ones who have witnessed the birth of nations, Prof. Wang.
And the demise of empires.
Yes.
I'm such a mixed up kid that I don't know where to begin. I mean, quite frankly, I have had so many nationalities. That's one of the reasons why I wrote to say that I didn't want that many more. I have one identity too many. I mean, I started as a Chinese. In fact, of course, in 1945, as the colonial powers retreated, everybody who was Chinese was a Chinese citizen by Chinese law. You had no choice. If your father was a Chinese, you were a Chinese. But I actually had a Chinese passport because I went to China. I went to study in China. I had a Republic of China passport, which I had until 1949. Then I applied to, happened to qualify to be a Federation of Malaya citizen, federal citizen. And I qualified. I became a Malayan. I was a Malayan, and then it became Malaysian. And to be honest, I still can't identify myself with a Malaysian. I still use Malayan, always use Malayan. And in my Malayan, it always included Singapore. I mean, I don't know whether every Singaporean felt that way, but most of my Singapore friends when I was here thought of themselves as Malayan too at the time. So at that point, it was Malayan. And I never expected Singapore to be independent, so I have no idea of what being a Singaporean is like. So when I look back, and then after that, I went to Australia, Hong Kong, and back to Singapore. But looking back at the whole stretch of things and so on, I think I have one clear identity, and that my identity has been with universities. Because I went into university as a freshman in China in 1947, and I've been to now, worked in, lived in, worked in, studied in many universities, but I, strictly speaking, have never really left a university. I went in 1947, and I'm still here. And not only that, on the same campus, when I started thinking about being a national of Malaya, and so on. So when you lump the whole thing together, what am I? And does it matter all that much? What matters to me is that I'm a university citizen. Because in any university I go to, I feel very comfortable. almost doesn't matter which university. When I talk to my academic friends, to students particularly, no matter where the students come from, we seem to share something. The desire to learn, the desire to understand the world better, to make ourselves better, to find something to share. And we have things to share. If you belong to this nation called a university, well, I'm a university citizen.
Now, Prof. Quah and Prof. Po, you have to follow that very tough act. Prof. Quah, please.
Okay, there's no way to follow that wonderful statement that you just made, Prof. Wang. Maybe I'll just say two things. One is that I was recently on SQ flights for long enough that I had the time to watch all of Jean Yeo's documentary. I don't know how many of you have seen this, but there's a wonderful documentary series called There Was a Time. And what it documented and what it depicted was the early nationhood in Singapore, the times that Singapore went through, from the troubles, the internal conflicts with triads, gangsters, something of all kinds, through confrontation, through nation building. And I thought that gave me very good insight into many of the things that I see around us in Singapore. It reminded me of many of the things that we hold in common across Southeast Asia. But that how important it is, while we acknowledge that history, to take on the challenges today. Challenges of the digital economy and AI, challenges of false information, challenges that even in the midst of plenty, there are people who still don't see space for how they can advance in life, the challenge of social mobility. So all of these are challenges that continue to be with us today, even as we no longer have the same kind of riots and violence and contention with lawlessness that used to characterize not just Singapore, but all of Southeast Asia. So it's very important that we move forwards while acknowledging the kampong spirit that comes from there, but also looking ahead to the things that we have to do as a post-Asian cosmopolitan member of the international community. So that is the lesson that I take from our conversation. And maybe I just end with, I was expecting someone to ask, if we used to have a poisonous shrimp strategy, what is the strategy today? So let me end with that in the history of that discussion, after the poisonous shrimp strategy, there grew a porcupine strategy, where the porcupine was more deadly than the poisonous shrimp, because it made clear, don't come close. Okay, we are happy going along the way we are, but don't threaten us. Don't come close. Right? And after that, there was the dolphin strategy. The dolphin strategy was that you can be a nice, cuddly, friendly, welcoming entity. But if you see enemies on the horizon, you can be agile and network with others who are like-minded, other dolphins. And sharks are afraid of dolphins for that reason. So we can continue to evolve and continue to thrive, but we have to constantly have the kind of university environments that make us think about these important issues, be forward-looking, devise ideas. We need to be able to explore ideas that sometimes go wrong, but it is safe, sandboxed in a university. But then we take the best ideas and we take it out there and engage with the real world. So that's the beauty of the community we find ourselves in today. Thank you all very much for being a part of this.
So I have to come up with all these ideas when they all have great ideas already. I don't know what to do. But just to say that this is NUS120, but it's also SG60. And I think that NUS is in very much a reflection of Singapore, of SG. And one thing that I think we have very much in common is that we're very forward-looking. both the university and in Singapore. We forward plan, sometimes we plan too much, I think, but we always strategize and we always look forward. And also because NUS president is here, I'm going to make a pitch for what the university offers. We actually have lifelong learning, continuing education as part of our curriculum, courses that we are open to alumni at discounted prices or something like that. I cannot remember, but Kartini can tell us. And also Olivia can tell us about this kind of activities. But basically, we are very much aligned with the kind of vision that Singapore has, which is that it is a nation of citizens that are always learning and, you know, never too old, going on and on and on. I mean, I myself was a mature PhD student. I spent years working in the government, but I went on to do my doctoral studies, and it was a wonderful experience, and I encourage everyone to do that. Well, not necessarily a PhD, that may be too long, but LKY school have master's programs. University have stackable courses for anything from technology to social sciences to everything. So please come for the courses at discounted prices. That is me speaking on behalf of President.
Sponsored segment.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, to borrow Prof. Wang's book, Home is Where We Are, we'd like to thank you for coming home. And we'd like to invite you for lunch. And thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Can we give a round of applause to the three esteemed scholars?
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause again for our panelists for today's engaging discussion. At the same time, we would like to invite NUS President Prof. Tan Chai and NUS Alumni Relations Deputy Director Ms. Brenda Tan to join our speakers at the front for a group photo. Thank you. We would like to invite everyone back to their seats, please. Okay. Thank you once again to each of our speakers for contributing to a truly enriching discussion. We would like to express our deepest appreciation to them who have generously shared their expertise and insights with us. As we have come to the end of today's panel discussion, we would also like to thank all of you for being a wonderful audience. We greatly value your feedback as it helps us to continue to improve on future events. We invite you to scan the QR code on the screen to share your feedback and suggestions. As we end this session, please proceed to Wee Tiong Ham lobby for lunch. Lunch will be buffet style with free seating. Please use the lift outside the seminar room. Thank you once again for joining us at this panel discussion. Please enjoy your lunch.